The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I finished wiping down the surgical trays. The sharp, sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air. My hands moved on autopilot, folding the cloth neatly, placing it back in the supply cart. "Clara, can you grab the suction canisters from the storage room?" Lori's voice broke through my thoughts. She stood by the instrument table, her movements precise as always. "On it," I replied, forcing a small smile. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I turned toward the door, the soles of my shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. As I stepped into the hallway, the hospital's peculiar stillness settled over me. It was always like this in the early hours. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you notice every creak, every distant hum of machinery. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine. It was just another morning. By the time I returned to the OR, Lori had been joined by Diana, who was leaning against the counter. "And I'm telling you, it's a glorified paperweight," Diana said, her tone dry. "The ARC scan's been sitting in PEDS for weeks now, and no one's touched it. Probably because no one knows how to use the damn thing." "Or because no one wants to go into PEDS," Lori replied, her voice calm but amused. She glanced at me as I set the canisters down. "Right, Clara? I mean, it's not exactly the most inviting place," I admitted. "But it's just an old wing, nothing to be afraid of." Diana snorted. "Sure, if you ignore the flickering lights and the creepy murals on the walls." "Speaking of the ARC scan," Mark's voice cut through the conversation as he entered the room. "Lori wants it moved to a more secure location in PEDS. Apparently someone's worried about it getting damaged where it is." "Great," Diana said, rolling her eyes. "Because that's exactly what we need, more work for a machine no one uses." Mark ignored her. "Clara, you're with me. We'll move it to the back storage room in PEDS." I blinked. "Me?" "Yes, you," he said, his tone brisk but not unkind. "We'll need 2 people to handle it, and everyone else is tied up." I glanced at Lori, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. Diana smirked. "Have fun in PEDS," she said, her voice teasing. Mark shot her a look. "It's just a wing of the hospital, Cruz, not a haunted house." "Tell that to the lights," Diana quipped, but she didn't press further. I followed Mark out of the OR. The hallway stretched ahead of us, the polished floors gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Mark walked a step ahead, his posture relaxed, but purposeful. "You've been down to PEDS before, right?" he asked without looking back. "Once or twice," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. "Not recently, though." He nodded. "It's not as bad as people make it out to be. Just a little outdated." The elevator ride down to the basement level was silent, save for the faint hum of the machinery. I stole a glance at Mark, his jaw set, his hazel eyes fixed on the numbers above the door. There was a tension in his posture that I couldn't ignore. When the doors slid open, the air seemed cooler, the faint scent of mildew mingling with the sterile hospital smell. The hallway leading to PEDS was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering faintly as we stepped out of the elevator. Mark didn't hesitate, striding forward. I followed, my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet. The murals Diana had mentioned came into view as we turned the corner, faded, peeling images of smiling children and cartoon animals that seemed oddly out of place in the otherwise sterile environment. The ARC scan was exactly where Diana had said it would be, tucked into a corner of the abandoned wing. It was larger than I'd expected, its sleek, metallic frame gleaming faintly in the dim light. Mark crouched down to inspect the base. "We'll need to tilt it slightly to get it onto the dolly," he said, his tone all business. "You take that side and I'll guide it from here." I nodded, stepping into position. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the edge of the machine, but I forced myself to focus. "Ready?" Mark asked. "Ready," I said. As we lifted the ARC scan, the faint hum of the hospital seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy silence. I focused on Mark's instructions as we maneuvered the machine onto the dolly. The elevator doors slid shut behind us with a faint hiss, and the oppressive silence of PEDS gave way to the familiar hum of the hospital above. Mark walked ahead, his pace brisk, as if eager to put distance between himself and the basement. I followed, the strange unease of that dim, abandoned wing still clinging to me. We didn't speak as we made our way toward the cafeteria. The ARC scan had already been secured in the storage room down in PEDS, but the strain of maneuvering it through the hospital's narrow hallways still lingered in my arms, now a dull ache. Mark had insisted on taking a quick break before we returned to the OR to retrieve the next piece of equipment. I didn't argue. The weight of the basement still hung over me, and part of me welcomed the reprieve. The faint buzz of conversation and the clatter of trays in the cafeteria provided a welcome contrast to the stillness below. Mark gestured toward a table near the window, and I hesitated only briefly before sitting across from him. The sunlight streaming through the glass felt almost jarring after the dim, artificial glow of the hospital corridors. Mark grabbed 2 coffees from the counter, setting one down in front of me without a word. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. He sat down, his hazel eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on me. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone neutral but probing. I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Just thinking." "About PEDS?" he asked, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Or something else?" I shook my head, trying to deflect. "It's nothing. Just tired, I guess." Mark didn't look convinced. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "Look, Clara, I know you're still figuring things out here, but you can't let every little thing get to you. It's just an old wing of the hospital, nothing more." I tightened my grip on the cup. "I'm not letting it get to me. I'm fine." He raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because you've been jumpy ever since we got on the elevator." I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off, his voice dropping slightly. "And while we're on the subject of being honest, there's something else we need to address." I froze. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his hazel eyes narrowing slightly. "That conversation we had a few months ago, the one where you—" "Don't," I said sharply, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked away. "We don't need to talk about that." "Yes, we do," he said, his tone firm. "You put me in a really uncomfortable position, Clara, and I get it. You were going through a lot, and maybe you weren't thinking clearly, but—" "I said don't," I snapped, my voice louder this time. A few heads turned in our direction, and I lowered my voice. "I already apologized for that. I don't know what else you want from me." Mark leaned forward, his expression still guarded. "I'm not trying to make this harder for you. I just need to know that we're on the same page, that we can work together without complications." "Complications?" I repeated, my voice bitter. "You mean me embarrassing myself? Don't worry, Mark. I've learned my lesson." He sighed. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." I stared at him, my chest tight with a mix of anger and humiliation. Before I could respond, his pager buzzed loudly, breaking the tension. He glanced at it, his expression shifting back to business. "We need to get moving," he said, standing up and grabbing his coffee. "The sooner we finish this, the better." I followed him out of the cafeteria, my emotions still raw but buried under the weight of our task. We returned to the OR, where the next piece of equipment waited on its dolly. Mark swiped his ID to unlock the wheels, and we began the slow process of maneuvering it through the hospital's hallways. The wheels squeaked faintly against the polished floors, and the occasional murmur of voices or distant beeping of monitors reminded me that we weren't alone. When we reached the badge-secured doors, Mark swiped his ID again, the lock clicking open with a faint metallic sound. The air inside was just as heavy as before, the faint musty smell mingling with the sterile hospital scent. The flickering lights cast uneven shadows on the walls as we pushed the scanner deeper into the wing. The storage room was small and dimly lit, its shelves lined with equipment and supplies. We positioned the scanner next to the ARC scan, Mark adjusting it slightly to ensure it was stable. As I stepped back, my gaze caught on something above us, a dark, viscous substance slowly dripping from the ceiling. "Mark," I said, my voice uneasy. "Look," he followed my gaze. "It's probably just a leak. Maintenance will deal with it." I frowned. "It doesn't look like water." "It's nothing," he said firmly. "Let's go." I hesitated, but the weight of his words pushed me to follow him. We left the storage room, the door clicking shut behind us, and made our way back to the elevator. The silence of PEDS seemed to cling to me, even as the familiar sounds of the hospital above grew louder with each step. The elevator doors slid shut behind me with a faint hiss, and the hum of the hospital above replaced the silence of PEDS. My arms ached from the strain of moving the operating table earlier. Mark walked ahead, his pace brisk, his coffee cup still clutched in one hand as we made our way back to the OR. He didn't say much, and I didn't press him. The strange drip on the ceiling, the flickering lights, the air that felt too thick to breathe, it all clung to me, a shadow I couldn't shake. As we passed the nurses' station, I overheard two techs muttering about the badge readers acting up in certain wings. "It's just PEDS," one of them said, shaking his head. "Always PEDS. I swear that place is cursed." His words stuck with me, even as I tried to brush them off. The lights had flickered earlier, too, but I told myself it was nothing. Back in the OR, Lori popped her head in not long after, clipboard in hand. "Clara, that operating table in OR3 needs to be moved to PEDS temporarily. Can you handle that?" I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure." "Thanks. I'd ask Mark, but he's tied up with the imaging team," Lori said, already moving on to her next task. I spotted Diana by the supply cart and called out, "Diana, can you give me a hand with this?" She glanced up, her dark eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the size of the operating table. "You're kidding, right? That thing's a beast." "I know," I said, forcing a small smile, "but it has to go to PEDS." Diana groaned, tossing a pair of gloves onto the cart. "Of course it does. Why is it always PEDS lately?" I didn't answer. "Fine, but you owe me coffee after this." "Deal," I said, relieved. We positioned ourselves on either side of the table. As we began to push, the wheels squeaked loudly against the floor, the sound grating in the otherwise quiet hallway. As we neared the elevator, I caught it, a faint, acrid smell, sharp and out of place. I paused, my nose wrinkling. "Do you smell that?" I asked, glancing at Diana. She sniffed the air. "What, the usual hospital funk? Disinfectant, sweat, and despair?" "No," I said, frowning. "It's burning, like something's on fire." Diana tilted her head, sniffing again with exaggerated effort. "Nope, just your imagination." I didn't respond, but the smell lingered, growing stronger as we approached the doors to PEDS. The hallway felt colder here, the air heavier. When we reached the badge-secured doors, I hesitated, glancing at Diana. She raised an eyebrow at me. "Well," she said, "let's get this over with." I nodded, pulling Mark's badge from my pocket. Sliding it through the reader, I waited for the beep and click of the lock. Nothing happened. I frowned, swiping it again. Still nothing. "Great," Diana muttered, crossing her arms. "Did you break it already?" "It worked earlier," I said, trying again. The reader blinked red, the lock refusing to budge. "Let me try mine," Diana said, pulling her badge from her scrub pocket. She swiped it, but the result was the same, a red light and an unyielding door. "Fantastic," she said. "Guess the ghosts of PEDS don't want us in there today." The smell of burning was stronger now, sharp and insistent. "I'll go get a manager's badge," I said. "Wait here." Diana rolled her eyes but didn't argue. "Fine, but hurry up. I've got better things to do than babysit an operating table." I turned and hurried back toward the OR, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. By the time I reached the OR and retrieved the manager's badge, my hands were trembling. When I returned to PEDS, Diana was leaning against the table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I approached, holding up the badge like a trophy. "Finally," she said. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." I ignored her, swiping the manager's badge through the reader. The lock clicked open with a metallic sound. The doors slid apart, revealing the dim, flickering hallway beyond. The smell hit me immediately, stronger now, almost suffocating. It wasn't just burning anymore. There was something else beneath it, something metallic and sharp. Blood. I glanced at Diana, who wrinkled her nose. "Okay, I'll admit it," she said. "That's weird, but it's probably just some cleaning solution or something. Let's get this over with." We pushed the table inside, the wheels squeaking loudly in the silence. The flickering lights cast uneven shadows on the walls. I tried not to look at them, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Mark!" I called, my voice echoing faintly. "Are you down here?" There was no response. The silence pressed against my ears, heavy and unnatural. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the table. "Maybe he's in the storage room," Diana said, her tone casual, but her steps slower now, more hesitant. We continued down the hallway, the smell growing stronger with each step. The sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder, but the hallway behind us was empty. "Mark!" I called again, louder this time. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive air. As we neared the storage room, a shadow moved at the edge of my vision. I froze. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Diana frowned, glancing around. "See what?" "Someone—" I started, but the words died as a figure stepped into view. It was Mark, but something was wrong. He smiled as he approached, but it wasn't his usual easy grin. It was too wide, too stiff. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical. "There you are," he said, his voice flat. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I stared at him, uneasy. We couldn't get the door open. Your badge wasn't working." He tilted his head slightly. "Strange. It worked fine earlier." Diana didn't seem to notice anything amiss. "Well, it's working now," she said, brushing past him. "Let's get this thing in the storage room and get out of here." I hesitated, my eyes locked on Mark. Something about him felt off, wrong in a way I couldn't explain, but I forced myself to move, following Diana as she pushed the table toward the storage room. Mark fell into step behind us. The lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I glanced over my shoulder, but Mark's expression hadn't changed. That too-wide smile, those empty hazel eyes, they stayed fixed on me. By the time we left Peds, my skin was clammy. Diana chatted casually as we made our way back to the OR, but I barely heard her. The feeling of wrongness clung to me, a shadow I couldn't shake. 3 days had passed since that unsettling day in Peds. I'd told myself to let it go, to chalk up the strange tension I felt to overwork and a bad night's sleep. But as the days stretched on, the feeling of wrongness only grew stronger, and every time I saw Mark, that shadow deepened. At first I tried to convince myself it was nothing. He seemed fine, better than fine, even. He was joking with Diana at the nurse's station, trading sarcastic remarks with Laurie during rounds. But the more I watched him, the more I noticed the cracks. His laughter wasn't right. It was too loud, too sharp, like the sound of glass breaking. His movements, once so natural, now had a mechanical quality, as though he were mimicking the way he used to move. And his gaze, it lingered on me too long, unblinking. I told myself I was being paranoid. I threw myself into my work, focusing on the steady rhythm of the hospital, the endless charts and rounds. But Mark's presence was always there, hovering just at the edge of my awareness. Every time I turned a corner or entered a room, I half expected to find him standing there, watching me. The breaking point came when Laurie approached me late in the afternoon, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Clara," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need you to come with me." I looked up from the chart I'd been reviewing, startled by her tone. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer right away. Her dark eyes darted around the room, scanning for anyone nearby. Finally, she leaned in closer, her voice shaking. "It's Mark," she said. I think something's happened." My stomach twisted into a knot. "What do you mean? Where is he?" Laurie hesitated, her hands clutching the edge of her clipboard. "I went to Peds to get the ARC scan for the spine surgery. He was supposed to meet me there, but... Clara, you need to see this." I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, and followed her out of the room. Laurie didn't say anything as we walked, her silence only making the unease in my stomach grow heavier. When we reached the elevator, she pressed the button for the basement level. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the familiar hum of the machinery filled the silence between us. I glanced at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her grip on the clipboard trembling. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors finally opened, the air seemed to shift, colder and heavier. The faint smell of mildew lingered, mingling with something metallic. Lori led the way down the dimly lit hallway, her steps quick and purposeful. The flickering lights cast uneven shadows on the walls, and I forced myself not to look at the peeling murals. My focus was on Lori, on the tension in her shoulders as we neared the storage room. She stopped in front of the door, her hand hovering over the handle. For a moment she just stood there. Then she turned to me, her voice barely audible. "Clara, just be prepared." Before I could ask what she meant, she pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, a sickly, acrid stench that made my stomach churn. It was a mix of burning and decay, so strong it felt like it was coating the back of my throat. I raised a hand to cover my nose, my eyes watering as I stepped inside. The room was dim, the single overhead light flickering weakly. The arc scan stood in the corner, its sleek metallic frame gleaming faintly in the uneven light. But my eyes weren't on the machine. They were on the figure slumped against the wall beside it. His body was bloated, the skin stretched taut and discolored, as though it had been left to rot for days. His face was unrecognizable, the features distorted and burned, the flesh charred and peeling away in places. But there, on his side, just visible beneath the tattered remains of his scrubs, was the small tattoo of a sparrow. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth as bile rose in my throat. Lori caught my arm, steadying me. "It's him," she whispered. "It's Mark." Mark had been with us just this morning. I'd seen him, I'd spoken to him, and yet here he was, lifeless and burned, his body slumped in the corner of this forgotten room. Lori's voice broke through my thoughts, shaky and urgent. "We need to call the police. They need to—" "No," I said, cutting her off. "Not yet." She stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Clara, we can't just—" Whatever I've been working with for the past few days," I said. "It's not Mark." The words hung in the air. Lori's expression shifted, confusion and fear flickering across her face. I turned back to the body as the reality of it all settled over me. The Mark I'd seen wasn't Mark, and whatever had taken his place was still out there, still watching, still waiting. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to find out. 3 days after we found Mark's body in the storage room, I still couldn't shake the smell of burning. It clung to me, a phantom reminder of the charred remains we'd pulled from the wreckage. No amount of scrubbing or cold water could erase it. The sparrow tattoo on his arm had been the only way to identify him, the skin beneath it blackened and cracked. But even more haunting than the sight of his body was the thing that had taken his place. I sat in the break room staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of me. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the distant hum of hospital monitors filtered through the walls. The imposter had been walking around the hospital for days now, wearing Mark's face, speaking with his voice. It moved like him, smiled like him, but I could see the cracks. I didn't know what it was or how it had taken his form, but I knew one thing for certain. Mark was gone. When it walked into the room, my stomach twisted. It carried itself with the same easy confidence Mark always had, but its steps were just a fraction too deliberate, its smile a little too wide. And when its hazel eyes landed on me, I had to force myself not to flinch. "Clara," it said, its voice warm and familiar. "You've been hard to pin down today." I swallowed. "Just busy," I said, keeping my tone light. "You know how it is." It chuckled. "Don't I ever?" I forced a smile. I needed answers. I needed to know what this thing was and what it wanted. But I couldn't let it know I was onto it. Not yet. "Hey," I said, feigning casualness. "Do you have a minute? I could really use a smoke." It tilted its head slightly, its smile never faltering. "Since when do you smoke?" I shrugged. "Stressful day. Figured I'd give it a try." It studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, let's go." I stood and followed it out of the break room. The hallway stretched ahead of us, the polished floors gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I kept my expression neutral, my hands tucked into the pockets of my scrubs to hide their trembling. It led the way to the staff exit, pushing the door open with one hand. The cool evening air hit me, sharp and bracing. The parking lot was nearly empty, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. It gestured toward Mark's car, parked near the edge of the lot, and I followed. We stopped beside the car, the faint smell of exhaust mingling with the crisp night air. It leaned casually against the hood, pulling a pack of cigarettes from its pocket. It held it out to me, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking one. "Didn't think I'd see the day," it said, lighting its own cigarette before handing me the lighter. Its smile was easy, but its eyes were sharp, watching me too closely. I lit the cigarette, the flame trembling slightly in my unsteady hand. The acrid smoke burned my throat as I took a tentative drag, coughing softly. "Not exactly a natural, huh?" it said. I forced a laugh, waving a hand as if to brush it off. "Guess not." For a moment we stood in silence, the faint glow of the cigarettes the only light between us. My mind raced, searching for a way to draw it out, to make it slip. I had to be careful. One wrong move, and I didn't know what it might do. "So," I said, keeping my tone casual, "I've been meaning to ask you something about hospital protocols." It raised an eyebrow, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Protocols, what about them?" "Well," I said, glancing at it out of the corner of my eye, "I was reviewing some of the emergency codes earlier, and I realized I don't actually know what a code yellow means. You've been here longer than I have. What's the procedure for that?" It didn't answer right away. For a moment, it just looked at me. Then it smiled, its teeth gleaming unnaturally white. "Code yellow," it said slowly, as if testing the words. "That's for a hazardous material spill, right?" I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded natural. "Oh, right, that makes sense." Its smile widened, stretching too far, too tight. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. There was something in its gaze, something dark and hungry, something that didn't belong. "You're nervous," it said, its voice low and almost amused. "Why's that, Clara?" I took a step back. "I'm not nervous," I said, but the words came out too fast, too sharp. It straightened, its movements smooth and deliberate. The cigarette dangled from its fingers, forgotten. "You're a terrible liar," it said, its smile never faltering. My chest tightened. I had to get out of here now. "I just remembered," I said. "I left something in the OR I should—" Before I could finish, it took a step toward me, its smile widening even further. "What's the rush?" I didn't answer. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty parking lot. The cool air burned my lungs as I sprinted toward the hospital entrance. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the doors, I shoved them open and stumbled inside, the bright fluorescent lights almost blinding after the darkness outside. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. It wasn't there. It hadn't followed me. But I could still feel its presence pressing against my back. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. Mark was gone, and whatever had taken his place wasn't finished with me. 3 weeks later, the nightmares still hadn't stopped. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that storage room, the smell of burning flesh thick in the air, Mark's lifeless body slumped against the wall, the sparrow tattoo on his wrist, the too wide smile of the thing that had worn his face. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. I'd tried to move on, to bury myself in work, in routine, in anything that might make me feel normal again, but it was no use. The hospital felt different now, every flickering light and shadowed corner a reminder of what I'd seen, what I'd survived. At home, it wasn't much better. The quiet was oppressive, the stillness too loud. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes set my nerves on edge. Tonight was no different. I sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over my legs, the TV on but muted. The soft glow of the screen flickered across the walls, casting faint, shifting shadows. My phone sat on the coffee table in front of me, its screen dark. I'd been staring at it for what felt like hours, willing myself to call someone, Diana, maybe, or Alex, but I didn't. I couldn't. Alex had called me yesterday from Japan. His voice had crackled slightly over the line, but his laugh had been the same. He'd told me how much he missed me, how he couldn't wait to come home. I'd clung to that call like a lifeline, replaying it in my head every time the memories of Mark threatened to drown me. The knock at the door startled me. It was sharp, deliberate. I froze. It was late, too late for visitors. My first thought was Diana, maybe stopping by unannounced to check on me, but something about the knock felt wrong, too forceful, too precise. I stood slowly, the blanket slipping off my lap, and made my way to the door. My bare feet were silent against the hardwood floor. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "Clara?" The voice on the other side of the door made me pause. It was Alex. Relief flooded through me. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, a smile already forming on my lips. "Alex, what are you—" The words died in my throat. He stood there, his sandy blonde hair tousled as always, his piercing blue eyes fixed on me. But something was off. His smile was too wide, the corners of his mouth stretching just a little too far. His eyes were flat, dull. "Hey, Clara," he said, his voice smooth and familiar. But there was something clipped about it, something mechanical. "Surprised to see me?" I stared at him, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. He was supposed to be in Japan. He couldn't be here, not now, not like this. And then it hit me. The too wide smile, the flat eyes, the thing that had worn Mark's face. What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I caught an earlier flight," he said, his smile never faltering. "I couldn't wait to see you." The words sounded right, but the way he said them didn't. There was no warmth, no inflection, just a hollow, practiced cadence. My stomach twisted. It wasn't Alex, it couldn't be. "Alex, My phone buzzed on the coffee table behind me, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. I turned and saw the screen light up with a name, Rachel Morgan. "I should get that," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Sure," he said, stepping forward as he crossed the threshold into my apartment. "Take your time." I backed away and grabbed the phone. My hands were trembling as I answered. "Hello?" "Clara," Rachel's voice came through the line, choked with sobs. "Oh God, Clara! Rachel, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice rising with panic. "It's Alex," she said. He never made it to the airport. There was an accident. Clara, he's gone. He's dead." The room spun. My legs felt weak, and I gripped the edge of the couch to steady myself. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not possible. My eyes darted to the figure in my doorway. It was still smiling, its too wide grin stretching impossibly far. Its blue eyes gleamed, sharp and predatory, as it tilted its head slightly, watching me. "Clara?" Rachel's voice was faint, distant. The thing wearing Alex's face took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The grin never wavered, its eyes locked onto mine. "Mark didn't last long," it said suddenly, its voice shifting, deepening, mocking. "Let's see how long you do." My blood ran cold. My mind reeled as I realized the truth. The thing hadn't just worn Mark's face. It had taken it, and now it had taken Alex's. The phone slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out. It took another step, its head tilting further, as if studying me. The smile widened, stretching beyond what should have been possible. The knock came again, loud and insistent, rattling the door on its hinges. But it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back.